to talk about design anthropology for emerging technologies. And I guess everybody knows what that is. It's a drone being made in a makerspace, and it's part of a project that I was involved in with Deborah Lanzeni, who I've done quite a lot of work in design anthropology, looking at emerging technology futures and data futures and a range of other things. Now, I'm going to start at the beginning, because I wanted this first part of the symposium really to map out a little bit what design anthropology and design sociology are. So what is design anthropology? And as Deborah said, design anthropology has been established for really quite a long time. And the way I see it is that it's actually emerged in three waves. And the first wave was very much more connected to the human-computer interaction research and was very much seen as being led by Lucy Suchman and the work that she did in Silicon Valley and the way she actually brought together anthropology and anthropological thinking with HCI research at that time. The next wave is one that I kind of see as being the material culture studies wave. And a lot of that was led by Alison Clark, who's a professor in Vienna now, but also worked in London with Danny Miller, who's a very well-known anthropologist of material culture. And that way really kind of focused much more on the question of object design and anthropology. So a particular kind of phase or focus in terms of the type of design research and design practice it connected with, but also a particular focus on the type of anthropology it connected with, because it was very much about the material and the object and the physical, as opposed to being focused so much on the technological, although anthropologists who participated in that wave also focused on technology. Now, the third wave is a wave which I think has really very much been led by Danish design anthropology, Rachel Charlotte Smith, Wendy Gunn, and Ton Otto. And it's very much a phenomenological design anthropology. It pays attention to experiential and sensory and the idea of the ongoingness of everyday life and questions of improvisation. A lot of it is based in the phenomenological anthropology of Tim Ingold, who's participated in that wave as well. And for me, that is the most exciting wave of design anthropology, which I've participated in as well. Now, I think it's exciting because it's a version of design anthropology that really puts the focus on the creativity of human beings, on the way that we improvise ongoing in our everyday lives, on the contingent circumstances in which we live, and then calls on design to actually understand those circumstances and actually to engage with them, so we can actually think about the question of what and for whom we're really designing. We're designing for a world that's ongoingly changing. We're designing for people who are actually creative and will do things with the things that are designed, and they might not be the things that we're expecting. Now, my own work and the work I've developed with colleagues, many of whom are here today and others are around the world, is really an extension or something that bears a relationship to the Danish design anthropology tradition, but also is part of what I call a move towards futures anthropology, which is a focus in anthropology that anthropology is always focused on the present and the past. So the present, as in the moment we're in, but has always then relegated it to the past. And there's a long history of why that happens. It's part of anthropological ethics. Because we don't feel that we have the right to actually objectify people as continually living in the future. So it's very much about not writing about people, but writing with people, and always saying anything that's happened is always into the past. But if we want to make change, we want to think about what's going to happen next, then we have to engage with futures. So we've developed, myself and a group of colleagues, and we have a network called the Future Anthropologies Network, which is a European network and obviously includes Australia as well. We really want to change anthropology. So anthropologists actually can set out to do research about the future, about things that haven't happened yet. So how people imagine their futures, how people sense their futures. How is it that you feel that your future might be in your body? It might be something you can't even talk about. But when you start to think about what things might be like tomorrow, what things might be like in 10 years' time, how does it actually feel? And can you necessarily even express that in words? A very good and very mundane example is when, quite a few years now, I bought a new house and I was going to renovate it. And I'd walk around the house thinking about what it was going to be like once it was renovated. But it wasn't something I could necessarily even talk about. I just would feel what it would be like when it was different. And I think that's something that all of us can do in our everyday lives. But for me, the other essential question of the relationship between anthropology and design now is the question of emerging technologies, which is one of the reasons why I've come to Monash to set up this Emerging Technologies Research Lab, because nearly every aspect of our everyday life now has some kind of element of new digital and emerging technologies a part of it. Technology's design is continually changing, continually presenting us with new technological possibilities, which might not come to market, might not even be in our lives, but they're still nevertheless there as part of our imagined futures and part of imagined societal futures. But everywhere around us, we're in a world whereby we're surrounded by data. We're continually producing data. Even the fact that we have our smartphones with us or that we're using our laptops, everything we do is generating data, which is circulating somehow and somewhere. So the way I try to think about the environments that we live in is that we're actually surrounded by invisible data about us, about others, which is aggregated to say more broader and general things. So if we're actually living in a world where data and technology and changing technology is part of our lives, how can we even do a design anthropology if we're not continually aware of the way in which that aspect of our very environments is actually part of the way we live? So I would argue that any design anthropology needs to, even if it's not about technology design, if it's not about our experience of technology directly, it needs to account for the roles that technology and data are actually playing in our lives and the roles that they play in our imagined futures. So there are two ways, I think, of doing a kind of a digital design anthropology or technological design anthropology. One is to focus on the questions of our specific direct relationships with particular technologies as they're designed and as they emerge and as they're used. The other is to do research about other aspects of our lives, maybe, for example, our everyday lives in our home, or a project that Yolandi and I are going to be working on this year, which is about energy futures, but to account always for the role that technology is playing in those futures as they come about. And this is what I call an interventional design anthropology of emerging technologies, because I'm interested in understanding the world and what's happening in the world anthropologically and in understanding how people imagine their futures. But as I said at the beginning, there's also a very important interventional agenda, because if we do want to put people at the basis of the work we do and actually understand, as I said before, that design anthropology does, is that we're actually designing and creating things, services, processes for people who are going to intervene with those services and products themselves. People are actually going to be creative with them. They're not going to do what we expect that they will do with them. Then there's also an intervention there in terms of ensuring that design and engineering account for those very facts within their processes of trying to even think about what technologies will be made and what those technologies are likely to do in the world. So that's the background. Those are the kind of principles, and that's where I think design anthropology should sit and what it should be about. There are a series of principles and concepts, some of which I've mentioned. So first, the idea that it needs to be a future-focused anthropology. If there are any anthropologists here, my message to you is that we need to push anthropology into a zone where we're not looking at what's happened now, we're not looking at what's already happened, we're actually trying to understand what possibly could happen. But it's not, obviously, a predictive approach. So, and again, this kind of design anthropology is an argument against a predictive approach. It's about trying to moderate predictive approaches, which might use statistics or economics. Economists have no problem trying to predict what our future is going to be like, for example. Anthropologists have big problems with that. So instead of thinking about prediction, the concept of emergence is much more interesting. So we need to think of the world as being ongoingly emergent, and that circumstances as they emerge will continually change. They won't be exactly what they think they're going to be, but they might be similar to what we thought they might be going to be like. For me, what I find very useful is this idea that actually the most dangerous and problematic kind of knowledge we can ever have is what we think we know, or what we believe we know. Because that's exactly when things can go wrong. And when we make assumptions about what's going to happen next, and we build on those assumptions, policies and strategies, and we design based on assumptions about what's going to happen next. If those assumptions crumble, then actually what we'd planned could go completely wrong, and it could be much, much worse than admitting right from the beginning that we don't really know what's going to happen, and to actually design much, much more for uncertainty. So the next thing to think about is contingency then, and improvisation. So if we think about all of our circumstances as being contingent, they always depend on what's going to happen. So a very simple idea is, the things that can go wrong in your morning before you leave home. What might happen to make you late? What might happen to make your journey not quite work out as you expected? And those are very relevant things to think about for certain projects that some of them my colleagues from Sweden who are speaking later might mention. So we're doing research about mobility as a service, sort of research about commuting, and many things that can go wrong in those particular moments of the day. So how do people improvise to actually get by and ensure that we get to where we want to go with whatever process we're involved in? We improvise continually to fill in the gaps between what we think we know and what we're familiar with and what we don't know. And we take that jump towards what we don't know, and we improvise to get there often because maybe we don't have everything we need around us to enable us to go ahead. Now, another set of concepts that I use as a futures anthropologist are anticipatory concepts. So I try to understand what it is how do we actually understand how people feel about what might be going to happen next, and feel about their futures. And the concepts I found really useful are the concepts of hope, trust, aspiration, and anxiety. Now, when we look for those in everyday life, sometimes they're hard to find. So one of our projects where we were looking at people's anxieties about data, we found it really, really hard to find anxiety because actually people do so much work to stop themselves from worrying about the things they're anxious about that anxiety only actually emerges when things might be about to go wrong. The other important point is the question around the digital and the material, the online, the offline. So those are now inextricable elements of our world. It's something like what I was talking about us always being surrounded by data and technology. We can't forget that in any of the work we do. So we need to engage with these human-technology relationships in almost all of our research and intervention now. So what then is the bigger picture? For anthropologists, I think there's this bigger picture that we've probably known for many years that people appropriate and improvise with technologies. I've got a video that I usually show when I talk about that, but I don't have, some of you would have seen it before, which I don't have time to show now, but it's about how people don't use washing machines to wash their clothes. What we've also, anthropologists, always known is that people shape their uses of technology socially and culturally and in relation to the contingencies of their lives. But what's really, really bizarre for me, well, it's not bizarre, I mean, I know it's there, in the world, is that dominant societal narratives really seem to be led by the belief that technological solutions can solve societal problems. Now, in the emerging technologies context, it's really represented in the places where you kind of hope that it wasn't, in the places where, you know, the most important advances in technology research are being reported. So, and I've got the 2017 quotes here. The 2018 ones aren't so different. So in 2017, Scientific American's listed 10 emerging technologies to watch. I mean, it doesn't matter so much what the technologies were, but they were described as being innovations that are on the verge of making a difference to society. And then the MIT Technology Review claimed, a bit more strongly actually, that there are 10 breakthrough technologies. They said they will affect the economy and our politics, they will improve medicine, and they will influence our culture. As if our culture was just there, waiting to be influenced by technologies. What will our culture do with technologies, for me, is the more important question. Now, with these kind of societal narratives, we also get associated utopian and dystopian narratives. So those are the more utopian narratives, all of the wonderful good impacts and things that these new technologies will do to the world. I think we'll be hearing a bit more about self-driving cars later, and I'll mention them again in a bit. But in that context, one of the arguments, the utopian one, is that self-driving cars will make driving safer. But the dystopian one is that self-driving cars will kill us, because the algorithm will decide who's going to die in an accident. The ones about wearable digital health technologies, one of them is that they will make people exercise more. And some things that Deborah was saying is they don't always make people exercise more at all. The other side of it is that the dystopian narrative is that they'll invade our privacy. So, which will they do in both cases? It's not actually the point that the technologies will do either of those things. The question is much more, actually, that those opportunities and problems are not created by the technologies or by the engineers who designed them. They're actually created by the social inequalities, the power structures, the form of human action, the human feelings that are associated with those technologies and their use and the way that they're rolled out in society. If we want to fix any of those problems and stop the dystopian futures from emerging, we need to fix society. If we want to make sure that the good that we hope for from these technologies emerges, then also, we need to fix society. And the technologies will not fix society. That's the question that we need to keep in mind. So what does a design anthropology of emerging technologies need to do? Well, we're not going to save anyone from the dystopia, and we're not going to help policymakers and industry find ways to make people accept and use technologies properly. We're not going to help to get nearer to utopian scenarios. What we need to do is we need to turn around the problem. We need to ask how these emerging technologies can be designed for human futures. And human futures where there's a lot more equality, we need to ask what they should be like. How can technology design support equality? How can it be ethical? And to do that, we need to collaborate with our partners in industry, government, NGOs, activists and other organisations. And that's what the second part of the symposium will be much more about. How do we do it? Futures ethnography, design ethnography workshops, collaborating with forecasters. These are all techniques that we've been developing with other colleagues in the lab and with other colleagues around the world. And I won't talk to you about exactly how we use those methods now. That can be for another time. But I think the point is that we need to develop new methods and new approaches where we collaborate between anthropologists and designers and stakeholders from industry, from government, from other areas, and really bring different groups of people together to think about how can we actually use our techniques, bring them together with other techniques and create really new ways of researching and thinking about futures. So that goes then for anthropology from the big picture to specific collaborations. Anthropology is a critical discipline. I mean, like Deborah was saying about sociology, we know how to work out what's wrong with society, and we're very good at saying that and complaining at and pointing at exactly what's wrong and who's wrong. But in the past, we've been much less good about doing something about it and intervening. But with working with design, we can actually become more future-focused and more interventional. And in doing so, we need to also, though, not just work with designers, we need to have collaborators who are engaged in real-world questions. People we can actually change thinking with by bringing people into focus together, to think about problems together. And again, with these partners from outside academia. Now, here are some examples. And this example is from a project that's going to be coming up later, so I'm not going to be talking about this now. Except to say that this is one of the projects we've been working on in Sweden, the human expectation and experience of autonomous driving vehicles. And to flag that this is part of our project team, the rest of our project team is here. And in this project we have developed fantastic collaboration between ethnographers, anthropologists, ethnographers from other disciplines, designers and industry to actually ask new questions and to create some really, really exciting new methodologies that we would never have been able to do just working alone as anthropologists. This project, this is a project team that I've been working with in Brazil with the Samsung Institute. Again, in this project, you can see we've got a really big project team. That's actually only part of it. The second year, the project team was even more of us. And again, we're working across academia in Australia and in Brazil, and industry in Brazil as well, the Samsung partners. And in this project, then, we've been developing new research techniques, looking at mobile phones and driving and safety, and thinking about new technological developments. And in the second part of the project, we've actually been thinking about what we can design for the future, so actually working together to create something new as part of a big project team, which has been a marvellous experience. And the third project that I'm going to mention briefly, but again, without talking about in detail, is a project we've worked on here in Melbourne. Again, really big project team. Here we worked with sound artists, sound designers, acoustic engineers, a group of ethnographers coming from design and geography and anthropology. And we worked to actually understand how motorway noise transformations created by the sound teams were experienced by local people in a park, which we did our ethnographic research in. And that project just gave us such interesting, fascinating insights about how people experience that environment, but also enabled us to think about possible futures and how actually traffic noise and data and ethnography and different design disciplines could come together in possible future interventions as well. So that's just a glimpse of the projects we've done. I want to come back now to finish by asking some of these core questions. So what are emerging technologies? Are they these things that MIT Technology Review and Scientific American are claiming? Are they technological innovations imagined by engineers and scientists and governments and industry that can solve contemporary problems? Or are they actually unfinished and inevitably incomplete technologies that, if they reach markets, won't provide solutions, but they'll actually create possibilities that people will complete and people will do things with? I think that's what we need to work towards, creating these possibilities. And as design anthropologists, we can do that. We can produce the insights that are needed in that way. Now, one of the things we've been talking about in the labs, I couldn't resist putting this slide in, even though I've gone over 20 minutes, is this question. Are we more than futurists? Because we've realised that a lot of the work we're doing is actually has some synergies with what people who call themselves futurists are doing. And have even discussed that sometimes with futurists. So what are we doing that means that we're different from futurists? Well, first we seek to understand futures in a non-predictive way, and I think some futurists do that as well, but our insights are much more deeply grounded in deep ethnographic investigations of everyday life in the present and how it could be imagined into the future. So we work differently from futurists. We're actually embedded in a context of academic scholarship and theory. So our insights about how human life might be in the future and how it's anticipated are actually developed in dialogue. If you're an anthropologist like me, in dialogue with anthropological theories of future and technology. If you're a sociologist, then the sociological theories and thinking about how those disciplines and those questions come together for us is really important. So there's another space that design anthropology is moving into, I think, which is very much about thinking about how our work can go beyond some of these other disciplines and moves towards trying to determine what's going to happen next, and how we can intervene in some of those debates as well. And especially when we think about this combination of in-depth research, analysis, scholarship, interdisciplinary collaboration, and the aim to intervene in narratives in the future, about the futures. So what do we need? Then, a different anthropology, that's not what it used to be, futures anthropology, design anthropology, methodologically bold anthropology, and a new future-focused ethics. We need a collaborative anthropology, which is a corrective to the lone anthropologist of old academia. We need to work with industry and the public sector and others. We need an interdisciplinary anthropology. We need to work with designers, engineers, computer scientists, artists, with everybody. I always say that within reason I'll work with anybody who wants to work with me, as long as I like them and what they do. So I think that's why we're here at Monash. That's why the lab is 50% in IT and 50% in Monash art design and architecture. And we're connecting with other disciplines as well. I think we need a very different way of thinking and working now that goes across disciplines. So to finish, a design anthropology for emerging technologies. It's interdisciplinary and interventional. It's rooted in ethnography. It's engaged with design and futures research. It's in dialogue with theory. It's methodologically experimental, and it's essentially collaborative. And it has this agenda to critique, but also change existing assumptions. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over time.